Welcome back to The Free Titan. Today I'm going to continue the series of talks on the planets and their mythological counterparts, going into moon. And in Greek mythology, the moon is incarnated, you could say, as Artemis. And in Roman times, that changed to the name Diana. As I've mentioned before, there's a lot of parallels between Roman and Greek mythology. Usually, the Romans renamed the Greek gods directly after the planets. So Cronus became Saturn, Zeus became Jupiter, Ares became Mars, Aphrodite became Venus, Hermes became Mercury, and we've already covered all 5 of those planets. And then the moon, in Greece, they didn't call her, in Rome they didn't call her the moon, they called her Diana. I don't know why. But the parallels are very clear between the two goddesses, and it's well known that they basically represent the same deity. And then also, as we get into this conversation, we're going to talk a lot about the connection between the sun and the moon. Now, from an astrological perspective, the sun and the moon are very connected because they represent the male and the female archetypes. The sun being the masculine and the moon being the feminine. The moon as an expression of femininity is very obvious. The moon governs the tides, which is the element of water, which is, I would say, a very feminine element because it's nurturing. And the moon also governs, well, it doesn't govern, but the moon, a full lunar cycle takes 28 days, which is more or less what a woman's menstruation cycle takes. So that in itself establishes a pretty unequivocal connection between the feminine archetype and the moon. Also, the feminine principle on a level of psychology, consciousness, is more emotional, more in tune with deeper emotions than the masculine principle. Again, I think this is a pretty easy statement to back up. And the cycles of the moon also seem to affect people's emotional temperaments. Like on the full moon, people often feel more emotional. And some more scientific minds might say this is mysticism, but I think if you observe it in yourself and you actually follow the lunar cycles, you will see this. I've even heard, I can't say that I've looked at the statistics, but I've heard that there are more certain types of crimes on the full moon because it would be a natural day for deep repressed emotions to bubble up to the surface, like anger, lust. So violent crimes of passion, things like that, I think can happen more during the full moon. And I've heard, again, I haven't checked this and backed this up, but I've also heard there's more suicides on the new moon because we're kind of disconnected from our subconscious minds. Which brings me to the next sort of topic of conversation discussing the moon, which is what else does it represent in astrology, and also mythologically, because usually what something represents astrologically, it represents mythologically as well. These things track very closely. So the moon is our ego mind, it's our ego consciousness, it's our subconscious mind. And when people hear ego, they think that there's something bad, as if we could just be done with our ego and be free of it. But if you see, especially in spiritual circles, people who want to just totally renounce their ego, they end up acting kind of strange. I think in India, there's this manifestation of the goddess Durga, which specifically helps people develop a healthy ego. And I think this idea of renouncing our ego, which is the moon, is really like it's kind of a puritanical or like extreme Catholic idea, because when we renounce the ego, we get caught up in shame for who we are and our individuality. And interestingly enough, in Catholic art, the Virgin Mary is often depicted as standing on top of the moon, as if it was like a wicked symbol associated with witchcraft, for example. And I think in the Middle Ages, this was a common narrative. However, Artemis, Diana, these Greek and Roman representations of the moon goddess, they wear the moon on like as a crown on their head. And what this means in a Western context, I think has largely been lost. But in an Eastern context, it's a common visual theme among the gods to have the moon on the head or on the forehead. And the moon, as the ego mind, or the mind of subconscious impressions and childhood impressions, and a lot of the good and the bad things that form who we are from past lives as well as from our childhood, this is the sort of foundation of the ego mind and our individuality. And that's not a bad thing. That's just what we're working with. I as Victor have all kinds of subconscious impressions from my childhood and even from past lives, which make who I am. They form who I am as an individual, as a personality. And I don't need to cut myself off from that. I think trying to cut myself off from that in an attempt to be holier or an attempt to be ego-less is would be an ill-fated decision for me to take. It would lead to all kinds of psychological complexes. And I would probably start to act very weird. And you see this, especially if you look at people who are dedicating themselves to like meditating, or even in a Christian context, just trying to overcome desires and egotistical ambitions and any kind of selfishness. When you're really consciously trying to work on this level with yourself, it's easy to develop some kind of complex vis-a-vis your ego. And so when we look at these, especially Hindu gods, specifically Shiva is often depicted as, and Shiva is like the liberating god. He's the god of spiritual freedom in India. He's the destroyer, but he's really the destroyer of our selfishness and our ego mind, our unhealthy ego mind, you could say. And he's often depicted wearing the moon on his forehead. Now, there's really deep symbolism behind this, because the moon, as our ego consciousness and our subconscious mind, when we, through spiritual practices and meditation, make that unconscious or subconscious impressions and traumas conscious, and we dissolve and release them, then we are said to be free of our ego consciousness in a bad way. And we can go into a higher state of consciousness in which we're not so worried about self-preservation, for example. We're not so driven by egotistical fears of self-preservation. And so the idea of oneself as an individual still exists. You're still Victor or Shiva or Bob, but the negative aspect of it you are liberated from. The aspect of it that wants to put other people down in an attempt to climb up in life, that wants to take from others in order to enrich oneself, that wants to think of oneself and really be controlled by the idea of oneself as completely separate from the rest of creation. And when we see ourselves as existing in harmony with the rest of creation, and not just in harmony, but actually in oneness with the rest of creation, when we realize our attunement to this universal I, which is like God consciousness, then we are liberated of the slavery of being attached to and limited by a definition of ourself as a separate entity. Now, when we realize ourselves as being one with the rest of creation, or in some sense one with all other beings, obviously that leads to an increased level of empathy, an increased level of natural instinctive morality, an increased ability to treat others as if they were an extension of oneself, an increased realization and feeling that what we do to others, we are doing to ourselves, an increased idea that how we treat others is how we will be treated. These realizations and attunements and intelligences all come from the realization of our oneness, and to get there we have to work through the unhealthy aspects of our ego. And so when you see this Eastern symbolism of the moon on the forehead, what it means is, in sort of mystical yogic teachings, the moon, the ego, is located in the back of the head, in the medulla. So you can feel where the spine enters into the cranium. There's like a hollow spot in the back of our head, and that's where the medulla is. And that, according to the Eastern mystics, is where the ego consciousness is located, in the back of the head. So when you see like people who are very proud of themselves kind of holding their noses up, that would be because their ego consciousness is so tight and contracted and limiting that they can only think of themselves. Whereas a lot of times, if you'll see people in meditation, like their heads are almost bowed, which is not just a gesture of humility, but it's a gesture of concentration where we're focusing on, we're bringing our energy forward into the pineal gland, which is very connected to this third eye, and may in fact be the third eye. I don't know, but there's definitely a connection. And so that's why Shiva, for example, and a healthy moon goddess like Artemis has the moon here or as a crown, because it shows that there's this really healthy conception of oneself as a part of creation. As an extension of this, the moon goddess represents Mother Nature. And so that's why Artemis is depicted in this savage, sort of virginal state. She has this savage, virginal personality where no man can see her naked. And it's, in my opinion, it's an expression of Mother Earth's desire to maintain her purity and her pristine nature as a reflection of God's glory. Just as the moon reflects the light of the sun, Mother Nature reflects the sort of etheric or spiritual glory of the unincarnated God, the sort of God the Father of Christianity, or the Brahman of Hinduism. And so this is a beautiful way of understanding what the moon represents and what Mother Nature represents. And it's not a lessening of God, it's simply a reflection of God in a way that we can really connect to when we are limited by a physical form or an identification of ourselves as separate, as a separate ego. So even those of us who have not realized our mystical and spiritual oneness with the Godhead can still feel in our hearts, when we're sensitive, the beauty of divinity all around us in nature. If we are in a state of stillness, we feel a sense of upliftment when we see beauty, or when we see the sunshine through the clouds, or a sunset over the mountains or the ocean, or we hear the beautiful noises of a creek running through the forest. Like, these are all reminders of our own divinity and our connection to divinity. But these reminders are lessened when you disconnect yourself from Mother Nature, and when you live in an environment where Mother Nature is not taken care of, or when she is abused, or when she is polluted. These are in these states, there's a diminishment of the reflective power of Mother Nature, reflecting this sort of divinity of which we are all connected to and children of. And I think that's why, and I think, Mother Nature also fights back in a way. Like, if you leave civilization, quote unquote, untended, like if a city is destroyed or abandoned, Mother Nature will eventually move back in. I remember in COVID, there were a lot of examples of Gaia, of Mother Nature moving back into places that had been civilized. Like, I know in the Caribbean, there were towns, in Caribbean and Mexico, there were towns where you had never seen jaguars and crocodiles like on the streets or where the hotels were. And after like weeks of being abandoned, they started moving back in. So the few people that were still there could see like jaguars where there was, a pretty high level of a high sort of development of civilization. And this is not a narrative meant to be anti-civilization or anti-development. I think there's a way for the two to exist in harmony, but that's probably another conversation. But this idea of a healthy ego and a healthy nature, healthy state of nature, go hand in hand. And I think probably when collectively we have unhealthy egos, we also create unhealthy, states of nature, in the sense that Mother Nature becomes polluted when we only think about ourselves. When we're not taking care of the forests and the air and the water, and we're only thinking of ourselves and our own acquisition, our own sort of material efficiency. And I'm not against free markets or material efficiency, but it has to be balanced with a sensitivity to the world around us. And it has to be, economic decisions and business decisions, I think, should be balanced with considerations for the well-being of Mother Nature. And there are probably a lot of scientific solutions to pollution that are yet unrealized or unincorporated into our world. But it's very interesting to meditate on the connection between unhealthy egos, unhealthy civilizations, and unhealthy states of nature, unhealthy forests, unhealthy water systems, unhealthy polluted air. And so the idea of Artemis, the huntress, as this savage virginal woman, I think is very connected to that. And I think in the West, one of the things that Christianity as an institution and as a set of dogmas struggles with is how to deal with the human ego. Because a lot of times, this is not what Christ taught, but the institution of Christianity does teach, in a way, probably Catholicism more than Protestantism, that we kind of have to feel bad about ourselves. We have to feel bad about who we are. We have to feel sort of ashamed of our desires and our lust. And, we have to sort of, at least psychologically, self-flagellate, like punish ourselves and beg for forgiveness. But God is all forgiving. And God has already forgiven all of our transgressions. In several Christian prayers, this idea of it is in forgiving that we are forgiven, And so when we embody this idea, this consciousness of forgiveness, we also invite the sort of divine grace that forgives us. But this is not really the idea or the feeling that's captured in a lot of Christian dogmas. And I think that's why in the symbolism of Christianity, especially in Catholicism, you see, the archetypal female, the Virgin Mary, the female, divine female principle, the Virgin Mary, like trampling on the moon. Not because she wants to, she doesn't want to, but the church and its dogmas have for some reason wanted to do that. And I think a lot of that probably comes down to a desire to control the masses politically through religious institutions, which unfortunately has always kind of been the norm. Probably expressed more acutely in the centuries of in Europe, when the Catholic Church really had a big political footprint. But yeah, so this idea of in Catholic imagery and dogma of treading on the individuality, right? Of making the individual sort of feel bad about being an individual, about making human beings feel bad about being human. This is an unhealthy ego, and this is an unhealthy moon. So this is a nice sort of background to what the moon is in a broader mythological, religious, and psychological context. The moon also very importantly represents motherhood. And what I was thinking of, I was just talking to my mom about this, who's also really into psychology and astrology, is how do you reconcile this paradox of a sort of fierce, savage, independent, virginal moon goddess with this idea of the moon as the mother and this sort of representation and embodiment of motherhood. And motherhood is not virginal because you have to you have to have intercourse in order to have a child. So you can't be a mother and a virgin unless you're the Virgin Mary. But in all other circumstances, and I do actually believe it's possible that the Virgin Mary was conceived without having sex. Whether or not that actually happened, I don't know, but I do believe that it's possible because I think in God all things are possible. But what I don't like about that is it makes us feel like to be perfect you can't have sex. And that's kind of the subtext of this narrative in Christianity. But I do believe in the possibility, and it may have happened. Of course, I don't know. And I don't just take dogma at face value. But it doesn't really affect how I see the divinity of Christ and his mother. But anyway, so how do you reconcile this idea of the moon goddess as a virgin with the moon as this sort of embodiment of motherhood? And my mom's answer, I think, was very good. And she said, don't think of virginity as a physical state, as a physiological state. Don't think of virginity as necessarily always meaning a woman has never had intercourse. Virginity can also mean purity. Virginity can be a symbol of purity and also unpolluted individuality, an unpolluted mind, an unpolluted ego, a pure ego mind, a pure individuality, which is the same as having a pure ego mind. When you have an idea of yourself as a separate individual, but you're unpolluted by selfishness above all else, you could be said to have some kind of virginal state of mind, because that is purity, more than probably in my mind being a physical virgin is. Because you could be physically a virgin and have a very polluted mind. You could physically be a virgin and be very selfish and be very violent to other people and be very manipulative and bad towards other people. And you could have a great deal of intercourse, especially in a loving context, in a healthy relationship, and be very pure and very spiritually advanced, and very pure of mind. And in my mind, that's more of that sort of virginity of mind and heart is worth more than a physical virginity would be spiritually. Just my opinion. But since we're talking about the moon and motherhood and virginity, I think that's what it means. And I think motherhood is such a beautiful symbol of purity and selflessness. Like, who embodies a healthier ego than a selfless mother, devoted more to the well-being of her family and her children than to even herself? Does she even exist as an ego consciousness when every waking hour is spent taking care of other people's well-being? And I think there you could actually see a very interesting lesson in the importance of self-care, because some people, very, very few people, but some very saintly people take care of the other people so much that they lose their own health. And I think, in this sort of very, very elevated state of mind, which very few people touch, you also see how to have a healthy ego mind, we also have to be healthy in how we take care of ourselves. But I think motherhood is such a beautiful expression of purity and healthy ego mind. And to go back to the Eastern symbolism of Shiva, as an embodiment of a healthy ego mind, or as liberation of ego mind, or selfishness, of the idea, the limitation of oneself as being disconnected from the rest of the God consciousness rather than one with it. He is usually depicted as a renunciate, as someone who's dressed in like skins of animals, wandering the mountains of the Himalayas. In the West we would pronounce it Himalayas. In the East they pronounce it Himalayas. So I like that pronunciation. But he's usually depicted meditating in a solitary way, although he does have a wife, Parvati. But he's usually depicted as not being engaged in the world at all. Not being engaged in householder duties or work or finances or, living in a house. No, he's just one with nature. He's just wandering the hills. In a way, a lot like Artemis, actually. Very untouched by civilization and its heaviness. And yet, so he represents this like male renunciate archetype of being totally unsullied by the world. And yet, interestingly enough, Artemis, who is virginal, she's also connected to motherhood. And I think we see a very interesting counterpoint to the purity and liberation of a god like Shiva in the idea of having an equally absolute freedom, completely involved in sort of worldly affairs. If you think of raising children and taking care of your loved ones as being involved in the world. And it is. You're not like banking, but you're still, all your energy is going into worldly affairs, in the sense that running a household would be a worldly affair. And so it's kind of showing the two extremes, the male and female extreme of finding liberation from the unhealthy ego mind. One, in totally walking away from the world and all responsibility, which is a common sort of motif or archetype, not only in the East, but also when you read about the lives of saints in monasteries in Europe. Very similar archetype to this sort of renunciate god of Shiva, where you're just renouncing everything to single-pointedly seek spiritual freedom and oneness with God. And there we see this this recurring symbol of the moon on the forehead, which is the overcoming of the unhealthy ego mind, or at the very, and also the overcoming of the idea of oneself as separate from God. This is what this moon on the forehead means. But yet, Artemis also has this symbolism. And I think as the mother, she shows us that, or as the goddess of motherhood, she shows us that this freedom can also be found in the world through serving other people in love. It doesn't have to be found in long hours of meditation or renunciation from the world. It can also be found in intense involvement in the world, as long as it's done to serve something beyond yourself. If you're working 80 hours a week as a banker only to enrich yourself, it's not going to get you there. If you're working or serving 80 hours a week as a mother, raising a family, or serving humanity in general, it probably doesn't have to be motherhood, but motherhood is like the purest expression of this selflessness. We can also find freedom in that, in service. And so we have this dual archetype, the masculine and the feminine, of freedom, spiritual freedom, one through renunciation and communing with God within, and the other through service and communing with God throughout. And we see through these symbolisms that probably these two paths lead us to the same place. But one is a feminine path of love, and the other is a more masculine path of renunciation and, you could say, wisdom. But I think motherhood also leads to a great deal of wisdom.